Okay, so in laying the foundations for all of this, we need to understand how the experiments themselves are conducted to be able to decide whether or not there's validity. So in this video 7 for Political Science 310 on March 18th, we're going to examine the experimental basis for political biology. So one of the big ways that we study political biology is through genetic analysis. And there are both biology and psychology are disciplines that do large studies of genetics. And there's just a ton of genetic information from these two disciplines. In political science, on the other hand, we have largely depended on various types of survey research, which has um, kind of been our bread and butter. But in the 1990s, there were political scientists like Hibbing who started thinking that the biology and psychology experiments were yielding enough information about behavior in general that they might be able to apply it to political behavior. And so there's been in the 1990s, also political science started doing experiments and not just relying on surveys. So one type of experiment was a lab experiment where they would bring in subjects into a lab and look at what they were doing on the computer screen. And so an example of this is they would put up a bunch of generic pictures and say which of these people would you be most likely to vote for in a local city council race. And there'd be a picture of a man and a woman, and then there'd be a picture of a black man and a white man, and then there'd be a picture of a tall man and a short man, and then there'd be a picture of a fat woman and a skinny woman, and then there'd be a picture of a man with glasses and without, a man with a beard and without, and those kind of things. And we began to narrow down who is the ideal political candidate, not based on issues or experience or anything like that, just based on what they look like. And so that was a lab experiment. There are also natural experiments. These are these are kind of activities that exist in nature. They exist in the environment, the actual real world environment that mirror what happens in the lab. They follow the pattern. And so in a laboratory experiment, you need a stimuli group and a control group. And this is kind of hard to do in most kinds of social situations, but there are some situations which lend itself to it. For instance, there's a big study done by one of my professors at Merced that looked at whether or not rain has any kind of impact on voter turnout. And so you could look across the country at where it was raining and where it wasn't raining and see where people turned out at higher and lower rates. And then you can compare those same areas to turnout when there is rain and when there isn't rain. And by combining those two sets of details, you can find out how rain affects voters. And what they found was that rain depresses Democratic vote, but does not depress Republican vote. And so now, before every big election, there will be articles in newspapers all across the country about, is it going to rain, and will it rain on election day, and will that affect kind of who wins? And so that is a natural experiment. So those are the kind of things got started. And as experimentation moved into politics, there was a group of scholars who started working on ties between genetics and political beliefs. So it was a time when the political science was moving away from its sole dependence on survey research, bringing things into the lab. And they thought, well, a natural extension of that is to bring genetics in the lab and see if it's got any tie into political behavior. And so one of the ways to do this is just kind of real generic overview. They'll take a Q-tip and take a cheek swab and label it and put it aside. Then they'll give the respondent, the respondent that they took the cheek swab from, an issues of the day test to determine their political orientation. And so they say, do you believe that the death penalty deters crime? Yes or no. The issues of the day test had previously been scored so that we understood that the way in which they answered yielded whether or not we had conservatives answer the test, we had liberals answer the test, and kind of developed a profile of a conservative and a profile of a liberal. That research was done long before the political biology experiments started, and that Society Works Best score is very, very reliable. So I just had you take a Society Works Best test so you would understand what they were measuring against. You got a feel for that. So in general, conservatives have said that society works best when oh, and also conservatives and liberals, there is basically a perfectly linear pattern between how conservatives and liberals score on this test. So liberals say, for instance, that society works best when there's lots of freedom, and conservatives say society works best when there's a lot of structure. And that's kind of a perfectly linear response. The more liberal you are, the more committed you are to lots of liberty. The more conservative you are, the more committed you are to higher levels of structure. Then, taking these two pieces of information, the cheek swab and the Society Works Best test, they were able to find out if there was any genetic kinds of components to the liberal conservative spectrum. And they concluded that that maybe liberal and conservative is just a handy way to describe a set of traits, a set of biological traits that encompass more than our political beliefs, but do give us some indication of our political beliefs. One of the limits of this kind of research is that traits tend to develop out of a cluster of genes, which each have multiple purposes. So it may be that one gene makes you predisposed to to participation, but it also predisposes you to having big feet. And there are multiple genes that kind of are found in people who are politically active, but those same genes are individually are correlated with a bunch of different things as well. And so that makes it very complicated to understand what's going on within the situation. It also means that we're not going to be able to find a conservative gene or a liberal gene. We're not going to be able to point on a DNA chain and say, that's what made you conservative, that's what turned you into a Republican. And so in general, there are 4 types of political biology experiments. We're really going to spend some time on the first 3 and not so much on the 4th one. So genetic testing, which is what I explained here, brainwave testing, which is done with MRI machines and is very interesting, although it's very kind of expensive, and many political science departments can't afford to buy an MRI machine to do lots of research. And then there are twin studies. We have a twin study center here at Cal State Fullerton in the psychology department, and political scientists are expressing an interest in that. And then we can look at the effects of food and sleep and pain and things like that on political behavior. So let's go on.